Hey guys, tonight we venture into the mind of a queen. Picture, if you can, the highest throne on Mount Olympus. It is not the one that crackles with static electricity and smells faintly of ozone. No, we're looking at the throne right beside it. Hera was a daughter of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, born into a generation of gods destined for greatness, but only after a rather traumatic childhood. This is the mainstream, accepted fact of her origin. The war against the Titans, the great Titanomachy, would soon begin, cementing the reign of the Olympians. Classicists still argue whether Hera's myths point to her being a far older, pre-Hellenic goddess, perhaps a version of the great mother or earth goddess, worshipped long before the Greeks arrived with their pantheon of sky. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon the seas, and Hades the underworld. But what of Hera? It's a recipe for disaster, a built-in conflict at the very heart of the divine family. The monstrous Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, the world was at peace, and the new pantheon was establishing its golden reign. Hera, in this moment, is a figure of immense dignity. She is described as being surpassingly beautiful, with large, calm, cow-like eyes, a compliment at the time, signifying a serene and majestic nature. She moved with a grace that commanded respect. Other gods deferred to her. She was, in every sense of the word, a queen long before she was officially crowned. She embodied the concept of telos, of purpose and completion. For her, her marriage was the ultimate completion of a woman's life, the foundation of a stable society. It was sacred, and she, the most regal and powerful of the goddesses, was the ultimate prize, the only one truly fit to be the queen of this new world order. Zeus, ever the connoisseur of power and beauty, certainly noticed his sister was not just another goddess. She was the key to legitimizing his reign. Marrying her wouldn't just be a union of love, it would be a consolidation of power, a merging of the wild, chaotic force of the sky with the stable, orderly principle of civilization. He needed her, and as we will see, Zeus had a very particular and very troubling way of getting what he needed. Her entire portfolio is, essentially, the celestial department of order, fidelity, and family values. And the CEO, her own brother and future husband, is the most chaotic, unfaithful, and disruptive force in creation. It is like putting a meticulous librarian in charge of a library where the head patron is a toddler with a jam sandwich and a pair of scissors. Her frustration was not only predictable, it was structurally inevitable. Her domain was arguably more intricate and more vital to the fabric of civilization than any single element. She became the goddess of marriage, women, childbirth, family, and the protection of the marital bond. Her very essence was tied to structure, legitimacy, and holy unions. She wasn't just the goddess of marriage, she was the divine embodiment of the sacred vow. Her power was in the promises people made, in the lineage of kings, in the stability of the home. In this view, her original identity as an all-powerful female deity was demoted and reshaped to fit the patriarchal structure of Olympian religion. She had to become the wife of Zeus, and her independent power was recast, her shrewishness, jealousy, and nagging. It's an interesting lens to look through. It suggests that her famous rage isn't just personal jealousy, but the fury of a demoted deity, a queen whose dominion was usurped, and whose authority is constantly being undermined by the very being who is supposed to be her partner. But while Zeus and his brothers, Poseidon and Hades, were leading the charge, casting thunderbolts and shaking the earth, Hera's story takes a quieter, more formative turn. She wasn't on the front lines. According to some ancient sources, particularly the poet Homer, she was whisked away for her own safety. She was fostered by the primordial ocean deities, Oceanus and Tethys, at the very ends of the earth. Her father, Cronus, had been given a prophecy that one of his children would usurp him, just as he had usurped his own father, Uranus. While the cosmos is being torn apart by a decade-long war of unimaginable power, Hera is living in a serene, watery realm, raised by the ancient personifications of the sea itself. This upbringing is crucial. It establishes her as a figure of stability and order, far removed from the violent chaos of her brother's war. She is steeped in the traditions of the old world, the world of the Titans, a world with a different kind of power elemental, ancient, and deeply connected to the natural order. This wasn't some backwater assignment. It was an education in a power that predated the flashy thunderbolts of Zeus. It gave her a sense of gravitas, a belief in a structured, unshakable cosmos. This is a quirky, lesser-known tidbit that colors her entire character. She isn't just Zeus's sister. She has a pedigree and an upbringing that is entirely her own, rooted in the oldest powers of the universe. His solution was as simple as it was horrifying. As each of his children were born, he swallowed them whole. Hestia, Demeter, Hades, Poseidon, and Hera, they all met the same fate, imprisoned within the belly of their own father. It was a dark, cramped, and decidedly unpleasant beginning. It is carved from ivory and inlaid with shimmering gold, adorned with images of peacocks and pomegranates. It is a seat of immense power, of regal authority, the seat of the Queen of the Heavens, and yet there is a coldness to it, an unforgiving rigidity that speaks less of comfort and more of duty. This is the seat of Hera, and from here she watches everything. Her husband, her family, the entire mortal world below, all of it under her scrutinizing gaze. She is the second most powerful being in the known universe, and as our story will reveal, that is a uniquely frustrating position to be in. You have to understand that divine justice in ancient Greece was not a balanced scale. It was a thunderbolt, a plague, or a curse often wielded for reasons that would get any mortal CEO thrown in front of a board of ethics. You probably wouldn't survive a single celestial performance review. Forgetting to offer the right kind of incense could get you turned into a spider. Being too attractive could start a 10-year war. It was a messy, deeply personal, and terrifyingly permanent system of management, and Hera was one of its most accomplished and perhaps most misunderstood executives. So, before you settle into comfort, if stories like this bring you a sense of peace, please consider a gentle tap on the like and subscribe buttons. There's no obligation, of course, but it truly helps our late-night journeys find more fellow travelers. As you get comfortable, feel free to drop your location and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now, let the outside world fade away. Dim the lights down low. Let the soft white noise of a fan carry you. Take a deep breath and step with me into tonight's story. Our story begins, as so many Greek myths do, in the shadow of a terrible father. She was rescued, along with her siblings, by her youngest brother, Zeus, who tricked Cronus into disgorging his divine children. Imagine that. This is where we encounter a fascinating debate among scholars. When the Titanomachy finally ended, the new gods divided the cosmos. Think about the cosmic irony. The universe is now ruled by a sky god whose primary hobby is breaking the very vows that his sister, the queen, is meant to protect. In those early days after the war, Olympus was a place of celebration and newfound order. So there he was, Zeus, the newly minted king of the gods, ruler of the sky, wielder of the thunderbolt, and utterly determined to complete his cosmic resume by marrying his sister Hera. He approached her, as you might expect, with all the subtlety of a lightning strike. He offered her power, prestige, a shared throne, all her grand principles, her resistance to Zeus, her queenly pride. None of it mattered in the face of this simple, desperate need. She knelt down, her magnificent robes pooling in the damp earth, and gently scooped up the shivering bird. She held it close, murmuring soothing words, trying to warm it against her own divine skin, sheltering it from the storm her brother had created. For 300 years, it is said, they honeymooned in absolute secrecy, a long period of apparent bliss before they revealed their marriage to the other gods. Hera was now bound, by her own sacred domain, to the most unfaithful husband in all of creation. She was the queen of the heavens, yes, but her reign was to be a constant, unending battle to uphold an ideal that her own king seemed determined to shatter. Her rage and jealousy, for which she would become infamous, were not born in a vacuum. They were planted in that cold storm on Mount Cithaeron, took root in the moment of the cuckoo's deception, and were destined to grow into a bitter, vengeful tree that would cast a long and deadly shadow over gods and mortals alike. But a foundation built on a trick is a foundation of sand, no matter how grand the cathedral built on top of it. A 300-year honeymoon is lovely, but it can fix a fundamental incompatibility that is woven into the very fabric of your being. He was chaos, she was order. He was impulse, she was principle. His power came from his thunderbolt. Hers came from the vows he was about to break with wild abandon. She drew the cuckoo to her breast, into the warmth and safety of her embrace. And in that precise moment of vulnerability, the cuckoo transformed. The tiny, feathered body grew, solidified, becoming the powerful form of Zeus himself, who now held her exactly where he wanted her. He was the king. She was the most regal of the goddesses. It simply made sense, but peel back the layers, and it's deeply troubling. All the gods, goddesses, nymphs, and nature spirits were in attendance. The muses sang, the graces danced, and the wedding gifts were legendary. The most significant gift came from Gaia, the Earth Mother herself. She presented Hera with a tree that bore magical golden apples, fruits that could grant immortality. This was no mere wedding present. It was a symbol of the eternal life and enduring power their union was supposed to represent. Hera, treasuring the gift, planted the tree in her personal garden at the far western edge of the world, a place that would become known as the Garden of the Hesperides, guarded by nymphs and a 100-headed dragon. Many scholars interpret the cuckoo story not as a charming fable, but as a sanitized metaphor for an act of assault, a mythological rendering of a non-consensual union where a god's true form is hidden to exploit a moment of compassion. In this light, the marriage that follows is not a choice, but a necessity born of shame and dishonor. Hera, the goddess of legitimacy, had been compromised. To preserve her own honor and status, she had no other option but to agree to marry the one who had tricked her so profoundly. But Hera, as we established, was a being of immense dignity and she had been raised by ancient sea gods, not in the chaos of the battlefield. She was the embodiment of order and sacred vows, and she saw her brother for exactly what he was, a philanderer, a force of nature who could not be contained, and frankly not a suitable partner for the goddess of marriage itself. A bit of a red flag. You might say she refused him. She refused him again and again. She had no interest in being another one of his conquests, another name on a long and ever-growing list. For her, marriage was a sacred, singular event, not a political merger. She held her ground with a cool and unshakable resolve that must have driven the impetuous Zeus absolutely mad. He could command the winds and shake the mountains, but he could not command her assent. And so, realizing that a direct approach was futile against her formidable will, he resorted to the one thing that could bypass her defenses: deceit, wrapped in the cloak of compassion. The story goes that Zeus, knowing Hera's deep-seated pity for creatures in distress, devised a plan of profound cunning. He waited for a day when she was walking alone on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, a place that would later become sacred to her. Then, he used his power over the heavens to conjure a violent, unseasonable storm, a dark, furious tempest with lashing rain and a biting wind that would chill even a goddess. And into the heart of this storm, he threw a tiny, pathetic creature, its feathers bedraggled and soaked, its body shivering uncontrollably. The bird flew weakly, crying out with a pitiful sound before collapsing near Hera's feet. Seeing this miserable little animal, Hera's stern and regal demeanor soft. Here was a life, helpless and suffering. Classicists still argue fiercely about this moment. On the surface, it's a story of a clever suitor winning his reluctant bride, and so the wedding was on. Despite its dark and coercive beginning, the marriage of Zeus and Hera was the most spectacular event the cosmos had ever witnessed. This sacred marriage, or hieroskamos, was so fundamental to the Greek worldview that mortals reenacted it in religious festivals every year, particularly on the island of Samos, which some traditions claim was the site of their wedding night. The beautiful wedding, the golden apples, the long honeymoon, it was all a gilded cage. A marriage, especially a royal one founded on such dramatic terms, comes with certain expectations. After the 300-year honeymoon and the grand reveal, the court of Olympus anticipated the next logical step: the divine children, the heirs to the cosmos. That portfolio would belong to Athena. No, Ares was the god of bloodlust, of mindless violence, of the savage, brutal chaos of the battlefield. He was impulsive, hot-headed, and universally disliked by nearly everyone, including, it seems, his own parents. This wasn't just a random disappointment, it was an act of retaliation. And Hera, who had intended to birth a masterpiece to rival Zeus's, was filled with shame and incandescent rage. This child was not a triumph. It was a public declaration of her failure. Was it that the gods demanded physical perfection, and his imperfection was an unforgivable stain on the family's honor? She, who would later spend centuries punishing unfaithful husbands and protecting the sanctity of the family unit, began her own maternal journey by attempting to destroy her son for the crime of being imperfect. Having found no solace or pride in her own children, and bound to a husband she could neither trust nor control, all of that immense, terrifying, and now deeply wounded capacity for devotion turned outward. It curdled into a relentless, laser-focused wrath. If she could not perfect her own family, she would dedicate her existence to destroying the illicit families of her husband. Her gaze turned from the cradles of Olympus to the mortal women and nymphs Zeus visited in his endless affairs. And the first to feel the full, terrifying weight of this redirected fury would be a Titaness named Leto. Or was Hera's rage at Zeus so all-consuming that she simply could not love a child born of that bitterness? And the story of his disability was a way for later generations to rationalize her cruelty. Either way, it paints a chilling portrait. Her love was conditional. Her children were either perfect reflections of her glory, or they were disposable embarrassments. He was a physical manifestation of the bitterness in which he was conceived, and she could not bear the sight of him. In one of the most shocking acts of divine parenting, the goddess of family and protection took her newborn son, her own flesh and blood, and hurled him from the glittering peaks of Olympus. Zeus had famously produced a child without a mother, the brilliant goddess Athena, who sprang fully formed and armored from his own head. This was the ultimate patriarchal boast, a complete circumvention of the mother's role, a slap in the face to Hera, the goddess of childbirth herself. It was Zeus declaring, in essence, "I am so powerful, I don't even need a woman to create perfection." Stung to her very core by this usurpation, Hera decided she would match him. She would show the cosmos that she, too, could create life alone. In a monumental act of parthenogenesis, a virgin birth, born not of purity, but of pure, competitive spite, she conceived a child all by herself. In the Iliad, Homer has Zeus look his son in the eye and tell him he is the most hateful of all the gods on Olympus. Ares was a walking, talking embodiment of the worst aspects of his parents' personalities. He had all of Zeus's unrestrained aggression and none of Hera's instinct for order. For 9 days and 9 nights, the infant god plummeted through the sky, a tiny, rejected thing cast out from paradise, finally crashing into the endless blue of the sea. He would have perished had he not been rescued by the sea nymph Thetis and the oceanid Eurynome. They raised him in a grotto deep beneath the waves, a secret forge where his true genius could flourish. Hephaestus, the rejected son, would become the master craftsman, the god of the forge, fire, and invention, whose creations were unparalleled in their beauty and cleverness. But his story is forever marked by that first act of maternal rejection. For Hera, the goddess of stability, a son who personified pure chaos, was a constant, infuriating reminder of her husband's nature, a living testament to the failure of their union to produce anything truly balanced or noble. The offspring of Zeus, the king of the gods, and Hera, the queen of order and family, were supposed to be paragons of divine perfection. And Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, a direct and vital extension of Hera's own domain over the lives of women. But it is with her second son, Hephaestus, that the tragedy of Hera's motherhood is laid bare, revealing a cruelty born from wounded pride. This is where her feud with Zeus takes a strange and competitive turn. The mainstream story simply states that Hephaestus was born lame, and Hera, disgusted by his imperfection, cast him out. They should have embodied the perfect synthesis of power and stability. The reality, as is so often the case in this family, was far messier and tinged with a deep, abiding disappointment. The rot at the foundation of their marriage, that coercive trick with the cuckoo, had seeped into the ground, poisoning the very children who sprang from their union. Their firstborn son was Ares, the god of war, but not the noble, strategic, intelligent side of war. They also had daughters, Hebe, the goddess of youth, who served as the original cupbearer for the gods, pouring nectar and ambrosia on a... But a more specific, and I think more telling, quirky version of the myth provides the motive. Her creation was Hephaestus, but he was not another perfect, shining Athena. He was born with a deformity, a crippled leg, and a shriveled foot. He was imperfect. Imagine that fall. Classicists still argue whether Hephaestus's deformity was the reason for Hera's rejection, or if the story of his lameness was created later to justify the almost unthinkable act of a mother, let alone the goddess of family, casting out her own child. This single act reveals the profound hypocrisy at Hera's core. And so, the queen's gaze turned outward. Her first significant target was the Titaness Leto, a gentle goddess, daughter of Zeus and Phoebe. Instead, she issued a divine decree, a curse of such breathtaking scope it affected the entire planet. She forbade any land that rested under the light of the sun from offering shelter to the pregnant Titan. Pregnant. The time for her to deliver was approaching. Divine labor is not a simple affair. There was one place in all the world that didn't quite fit the description of land under the sun. It was a tiny, barren, rocky island named Delos, which, according to myth, was not anchored to the ocean floor. It was a floating island, drifting aimlessly upon the waves. Because it was not fixed, it was technically not part of Gaia proper. It was a loophole in Hera's cosmic law. Desperate, Leto swam to this floating rock, and he gave her sanctuary. And Leto was in agony for days. The other goddesses, taking pity on her, had finally managed to bribe Eileithyia and sneak her away from Hera. The price for consorting with Zeus was now clear to all. It was exile, torment, and the wrath of a queen who could turn the entire world against you. A new power couple had just arrived on Olympus, born from suffering and destined to be thorns in Hera's side for eternity. And Hera's reign of terror against her husband's lovers was just getting started. With the goddess of childbirth present, Leto delivered her children. First came Artemis, the future goddess of the hunt, and in a stunning display of her own innate power, the newborn Artemis, only moments old, immediately turned and helped her mother through the grueling 9-day delivery of her twin brother, Apollo. 4 weeks. This is where Hera's cruelty becomes exquisitely personal. Remember her daughter, Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth. It was Eileithyia's sacred duty to attend to all births, to ease the pain of labor and ensure a safe delivery. But Hera, in an act of supreme vengeance, forbade her own daughter from helping Leto. She held the key to ending Leto's suffering and kept her locked away on Olympus, effectively weaponizing her own domain against her rival. She was denying Leto the one thing she, as the goddess of family and women, was supposed to protect. Exhausted and hunted, she wandered. She traveled across Thrace, through Asia Minor, across islands and mainlands. But everywhere she went, the land itself recoiled from her. Cities barred their gates. Kings trembled at the thought of Hera's retribution. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to whisper, "You are not welcome here." She was parched with thirst, but rivers would dry up as she approached. She was starved for rest, but the shade of trees would retreat. It was a master class in psychological torture, orchestrated by a queen who knew that true suffering is not a single, sharp pain, but a slow, grinding erosion of all hope. Think about that for a moment. It wasn't just a command for mortals to shun her. It was a law imposed upon Gaia, the earth herself. Classicists still argue whether the myth of Leto's persecution is actually a political allegory. In this view, Leto represents the arrival of a new religion, the powerful cult of Apollo into the Greek world. The established lands, all of which had their own patron gods and were firmly under the influence of the Hera-worshipping establishment, rejected this new cult. The story of Leto's wandering, then, becomes a mythic retelling of the difficult, real-world process of this new faith struggling to find a place to build its temples and establish itself. It's a fascinating theory. The myth becomes a reflection of religious and political turf wars among the ancient Greeks. Every continent, every island, every mountain pass and fertile valley was now legally and divinely bound to reject Leto. She was declared a refugee on a cosmic scale, sentenced to wander endlessly with no place to rest, no place to find refuge, and most importantly, no place to give birth. In some versions of the myths, Leto was one of Zeus's first great loves, their affair predating his marriage to Hera, which only makes what happens next all the more tragic. This is a quirky, terrifying tidbit from the ancient poet Callimachus. She didn't just rely on fear of her name. She deployed her own children and loyal agents as sentinels. Her brutal son Ares, with his bronze chariot, was tasked with patrolling the earth, threatening any city or kingdom that might consider offering sanctuary. And her swift messenger, the rainbow goddess Iris, was stationed at the edge of the heavens to ensure no other deity intervened. To add a monstrous element to the chase, Hera also unleashed the great python, a chthonic serpent born from the mud of the great flood, to actively hunt Leto, to chase her from any potential hiding spot. This was not just a fit of jealousy. It was a military operation. Hera was the commander, and her objective was the complete and utter despair of her rival. Leto was guilty of nothing more than being loved by Zeus in the past. But when Hera learned that Leto was carrying the king's children, that past love became a present crime. The queen's rage, honed by her own disappointing marriage and her frustrating children, was now ready to be unleashed. And it would not be a swift, hot-headed punishment. It would be a cold, calculated, and systematic eradication of hope. Hera did not confront Leto directly. She did not throw a thunderbolt or engage in a shouting match to enforce this grand curse. Hera set up what can only be described as a celestial blockade. So began Leto's agonizing journey, and all the while, it is in moments like this that some scholars see a different story unfolding. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto's suffering was absolute, but even the most perfect curse can have a loophole. There, clinging to a sacred palm tree, her ordeal finally came to an end. The birth of the twin archers marked the failure of Hera's curse, but the success of her warning. Hera, it seems, learned a valuable lesson from the affair with Leto. A full frontal assault using overwhelming force, planetary decrees, and monstrous beasts could, with enough divine intervention and a convenient loophole, be the twin archers, Apollo and Artemis, were now living, breathing proof of that. For her next major rival, she would not use the blunt instrument of a celestial blockade. She would use a surgeon's scalpel. Her target was a mortal this time. The princess of Thebes, Semele. Hera, Hespero, pressed on. If he truly is Zeus, then he should prove it. The next time Zeus came to her, she played her part. She extracted from him the unbreakable oath, making him swear on the black, swirling waters of the Styx to grant any one thing she desired. This is where we see the cosmic rules that bind even the gods. To save his unborn son, he performed a desperate act of divine surgery. Was it merely a cautionary tale about mortal hubris? A warning not to gaze upon the sacred? And best of all, she had done it all without laying a finger on anyone. She had simply held up a mirror, allowing Semele's own love and insecurity to become the fire that consumed her. She had refined her methods from brute force to psychological warfare. She was not just a queen of power, but a queen of strategy, and her list of targets was still very, very long. Or is it something deeper, a foundational myth for the unique god, Dionysus? His entire domain is about crossing boundaries between joy and madness, life and death, mortal and divine. This story gives him the perfect origin. He is born of a mortal woman's womb, but gestated and birthed from a god's body. Semele's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a necessary, sacrificial step in the creation of a god who would forever walk between two worlds. He carefully took the infant, cut open his own thigh, and sewed the baby inside, transforming his own body into a second womb. 3 months later, from the thigh of Zeus Dionysus, the twice-born god would emerge. Zeus, deeply in love and suspecting nothing, swore the oath willingly. Only then did Semele, prompted by Hera's wicked script, reveal her request. I wish to see you in your true form. A real god would not deny you proof of his love. Have him grant you a single wish. That's the only way to be sure, my child. Make him swear it. And then came the must. Make him swear by the river Styx. An oath so powerful, not even the king of the gods can break it. Then, once he is sworn, ask him to appear before you not as a mortal, but as he appears before his wife, Hera, in all his divine glory. Then you will know his love is true. Then your child will know his father is a god. And for a mortal, Hera had a far more insidious weapon in her arsenal. She would make Semele the architect of her own destruction. This detail is crucial. He wasn't angry. He was devastated. He tried to mitigate the disaster, choosing the very smallest of his thunderbolts, cladding himself in the least of his divine radiance. But it was no use. The difference between a god-S, true form, and a mortal S is the difference between the sun and a candle. As he entered her chambers, the air began to hum and crackle with raw power. A brilliant, terrifying light filled the room, a light that was also pure energy, pure heat. Semele gazed upon her lover's true form for a single, ecstatic, and fatal moment. Then she was gone, incinerated into a pile of fine ash. He begged her to reconsider, to ask for anything else. Kingdoms, riches, eternal youth, all would be hers. but the oath was sworn. As some ancient sources emphasize, his omnipotence had a boundary. He was utterly powerless to refuse without shattering the very fabric of cosmic law. The trap wasn't just for Semele, it was for him to. He was forced by his own word to become the weapon of his lover's destruction. Semele was the daughter of King Cadmus, a young woman of breathtaking beauty who had captured the wandering eye of Zeus. The king of the gods would visit her in secret, always under the cloak of darkness, his true, radiant form hidden from her mortal eyes. She didn't appear as a terrifying queen, but as someone Semele would trust implicitly. Biro, her childhood nurse, a stooped, kindly, grey-haired old woman. It's wonderful to see you so happy, but tell me about this lover of yours. You say he is Zeus himself. She'll let the question hang in the air. It's only, I worry for you. Many a mortal man has pretended to be a god to trick a young woman. And what if it's something worse? A dark sorcerer, a monster in disguise. Are you truly sure? Every word was a carefully placed seed of insecurity. She preyed on the fear that lurks in every heart that has found improbable happiness. The fear that it is not real, that you are not worthy of it. Leaning on a cane, her face a roadmap of feigned worry and affection, Hera entered the princess's chambers. She found Semele radiant, glowing with the secret of her divine lover and the new life growing within her. After the pleasantries, the disguised Hera began her work, her voice a soft, poisonous whisper. Semele was, by all accounts, deeply in love. She was living in a whirlwind romance with a powerful, mysterious, and divine stranger. On Olympus, Hera watched, and her anger began to simmer. This wasn't just another affair. This was happening in Thebes, a city founded on dragon's teeth, a place with a proud and storied lineage. This union was an affront to her right in the heart of the mortal world. She decided it was time for a personal visit. She descended from the heavens, cloaking her divine aura and transforming herself. "My dear child," she might have said, patting Semele's hand. Semele, of course, insisted her lover was the real Zeus, but the poison was already working. It was the perfect trap. Semele, her mind now clouded with doubt and a desperate need for validation, thought it was a brilliant idea. A chilling horror washed over Zeus. He knew, instantly, what this meant. With a heavy heart, he returned to Olympus. But from the smoldering remains, Zeus saw the 6-month-old fetus, miraculously unharmed. This is where classicists still argue about the story's meaning. For Hera, the victory was absolute. Her rival was dead. The child was, for a time, conveniently hidden. After the grand fiery tragedies of goddesses and princesses, Hera's strategy evolved. Her vigilance on Olympus became something akin to a cosmic audit of her husband's indiscretions. She learned that it wasn't enough to punish the primary rival. A truly successful campaign of order required dismantling the entire network of support. Zeus was lazy and predictable in his desires, and he relied on a vast network of enablers, lookouts, and accomplices. From this point on, anyone who aided the king's affairs, no matter how minor their role, was placed on Hera's list. And she would prove to be a master of poetic justice, tailoring each punishment to fit the crime with a chilling precision. Our next case study is not one of Zeus's lovers, but a simple accessory to the fact. Her name was Echo, and she was an Oread, a mountain nymph. Before her punishment, she was life itself. Imagine a sun-dappled clearing high in the mountains, the air smelling of pine and wild thyme. Echo was the spirit of that place. She was renowned for two things: her stunningly beautiful voice and her absolute unceasing love of conversation. She was a storyteller, a gossip, a fountain of pleasantries and intricate tales. The other nymphs adored her. Her voice was the soundtrack to their immortal, carefree lives. She could talk the leaves from the trees, and she loved nothing more than the sound of her own clever words filling the pristine mountain air. This very talent is what drew the attention of Zeus. He found a practical, if ignoble, use for the talkative nymph. The mountains were a favorite haunt of his for romancing Echo's fellow nymphs. The problem was that Hera was notoriously suspicious, and would often make unannounced trips to the mountainsides to try and catch him in the act. So, a system was devised whenever Hera's formidable presence was felt approaching. When the air grew tense and the other nymphs scattered for cover, Echo's job was to stay put. She would intercept the queen with a bright, welcoming smile. She would launch into a long, rambling story, flattering the queen on her magnificent dress, asking about the latest gossip from Olympus. recounting a funny thing that happened with a satyr the other day. She could spin words into a web, a beautiful, intricate trap of conversation that would hold the queen's attention for precious minutes. It was just enough time for Zeus and his latest conquest to tidy up and slip away. Echo, for her part, probably thought of it as a harmless game, a way to help her friends and the big boss out, all while doing what she loved most, talking. She failed to appreciate the danger of placing herself between a jealous queen and her quarry. One day, after being held captive by yet another of Echo's delightful, endless monologues, Hera's patience finally snapped. The nymph's performance was a little too smooth, the flattery a little too thick. The queen paused, her sharp eyes scanning the clearing, and she understood the ruse. The sudden silence from the woods, the faint scent of Zeus's lightning-tinged aura. She had been played for a fool. Her anger was not the explosive, fiery rage that consumed Seth. It was a cold, intellectual fury. She looked at the beautiful, talkative nymph, whose greatest gift was her voice, and she crafted a curse of perfect, tragic irony. This voice, Hera said, her own voice dangerously quiet, the one you have used so cleverly to deceive me, will no longer serve your own thoughts. From this day forward, you will never speak first again, and because you so love to have the last word, from now on, the last word is all you will ever have. In that moment, Echo's world was shattered. She opened her mouth to plead, to explain, but no words came out. The rich tapestry of her mind, filled with stories and songs, was now locked behind a door to which she no longer had the key. The immediate aftermath was heartbreaking. She would see her nymph friends across a stream and long to call out a greeting, but she was silent. They would speak to her, and when she tried to answer, all she could do was parrot the final few words of their own sentences. A frustrating, meaningless fragment. "How are you today?" they might ask. "You today," she would reply. Her friends, confused and frustrated, slowly began to drift away. The vibrant center of their community had become a strange, broken mirror. The curse stripped her of her identity, her friendships, and her joy, leaving her in a prison of profound loneliness. She fled from her home, hiding in desolate ravines and lonely mountain caves. Her only company the words of others. Classicists still argue whether this is primarily a tale of divine punishment, or if it stands as one of the most elegant myths ever conceived. It is, in essence, a story created to explain a natural phenomenon. Before this myth, an echo was just a sound bouncing off a rock. After this myth, it became the sorrowful, disembodied voice of a heartbroken nymph, desperately trying to communicate, but forever doomed to repeat what she hears. It gives the natural world a soul and a sad, romantic history. Echo's own tragedy was not yet complete. In her lonely wandering, she saw him, Narcissus, a youth of such unearthly beauty that he had a trail of broken hearts behind him, yet he had never loved anyone but himself. Echo was instantly, deeply, and hopelessly smitten. She followed him through the woods, her heart aching with a love she could not express. When he, sensing he was being followed, called out, "Is anyone there?" her heart leaped. "There," she replied. But their famous, tragic conversation was doomed from the start. Every time he spoke, her reply was just his own words, thrown back at him, until he, in his arrogance, cruelly dismissed her. That final rejection was the blow that broke her. She wasted away from grief, her body slowly fading, losing its substance until all that was left of the once vibrant nymph was her voice, and that voice remains, a permanent resident of the world's lonely places, forever repeating the last words of passers-by, a permanent, audible scar left by Hera's perfectly crafted, quiet revenge. It becomes clear, as you trace the path of Hera's vengeance, that there was a terrifying logic to her cruelty. Her punishments were never random. They were bespoke, tailored with an artist's eye to the specific nature of the crime and the criminal. After the quiet, fading tragedy of Echo's voice, the pendulum of her wrath swung back from the subtle to the spectacularly physical. She had tried curses from afar. She had tried psychological manipulation, and now she would try something new, direct ownership. Her next rival would be imprisoned, not in a tower, but in her own body, transformed into a beast, and held as the queen's personal property. Her target was a young woman named Io, a princess of Argos. What made Zeus's affair with Io a particularly egregious insult, an unforgivable act of hubris, was that Io was not just any mortal. She was a dedicated, virgin priestess in Hera's own most sacred temple. For Zeus to seduce her was not just infidelity, it was sacrilege. It was a defilement of the queen's own holy ground, a corruption of one of her own chosen servants. This time, for Hera, it was not just personal. It was a direct attack on her honor and her divine authority. Zeus, for his part, knew he was crossing a line. To hide his transgression, he wrapped the entire world in a thick, unnatural blanket of dark clouds, hoping to conduct his affairs under this veil of manufactured night. This, of course, was about as subtle as a teenager hiding cigarette smoke from his parents. For Hera, a sudden, unexplained meteorological event was her husband's signature calling card. Piercing through the gloom, she descended to Earth, fully expecting to find him in a compromising position. Zeus, hearing her approach, panicked, thinking fast, but not necessarily thinking well. He used his power to instantly transform Io into a beautiful, snow-white heifer, just as Hera appeared. The queen landed in a sunlit meadow, the magical clouds instantly dissipated by her presence, only to find her husband standing alone, looking remarkably innocent, next to a single, strikingly beautiful young cow. Hera was not fooled for a second, but instead of exploding with rage, she put on the mask of cool appraisal. She had learned from her past encounters. A direct confrontation could be messy. A strategic play was far more effective. She walked over to the heifer, circling it, admiring its flawless white coat and its sad, intelligent, and distinctly human-looking eyes. "Oh, my dear husband," she cooed, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "What a magnificent creature! I have never seen one so perfect. Where did she spring from?" Zeus mumbled something about the cow being born of the earth. Spontaneously, Hera smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "She is so beautiful," she said. "Would you do me the smallest of favors, my king? Give her to me, as a gift." The trap was sprung, and it was perfect. Zeus was caught. If he, the king of the gods, refused his own wife such a simple, petty gift as a cow, it would be an immediate admission of guilt. His hands were tied. To deny her was to confess, and so, with a heart heavy with dread, he had to agree. He handed the metaphorical leash to Hera, condemning his lover to the direct, personal custody of her most vicious enemy. Hera now owned her rival, body and soul, but ownership requires security. Hera knew Zeus would try to steal the heifer back the moment her back was turned. She needed a guard, a jailer so perfect in his vigilance that no rescue attempt, no matter how stealthy, could possibly succeed. She summoned Argus Panoptes. Argus was a primordial giant, a towering figure whose chief characteristic was the source of his name, Panoptes, which means all-seeing. His body, or in some versions just his head, was covered in 100 bright, keen eyes. And here is the quirky tidbit that makes him the perfect warden. His eyes never all slept at once. At any given moment, 2 might be closed in slumber, while the other 98 remained wide open, scanning every direction. He was the personification of perpetual surveillance. There was no sneaking past. Argus.io's new life was a psychological nightmare. She was a princess trapped in the body of livestock. Her mind was filled with complex thoughts, with fear and despair, but when she tried to scream, only a mournful hollow moo would emerge from her throat. She was forced to eat the bitter, scratching grass of the fields and drink from muddy puddles. At night, she was tethered like an animal, her every move watched by that constellation of unblinking eyes. One day, Argus led her to the banks of her home river, the domain of her father, the river god. In Atchus, her sisters, the water nymphs, gathered around the beautiful, sad-looking cow, stroking her coat, but they did not recognize her. In an act of pure desperation, Io lifted a hoof and painstakingly scratched 2 letters in the riverside dust. Io, her father, saw it and understood. A terrible grief fell over the family, but they were powerless. They could weep, but they could not challenge Hera's 100-eyed sentinel. Classicists still argue about the deeper meaning of this myth. Some contend that Io, with her cow form and crescent-shaped horns, was originally a powerful pre-Hellenic moon goddess. Her story, in this interpretation, is a mythological account of her independent cult being violently suppressed and absorbed by the dominant Olympian religion. She is transformed and put under the watchful eye of the cult of Hera, her former glory reduced to a cautionary tale. For now, Io remained a prisoner, a sentient mind trapped in a beastly form, forever watched, forever separated from those she loved. Hera's victory was, for the moment, total. She had her rival in a cage of flesh and bone, and the guard was foolproof. From his throne on Olympus, Zeus looked down, heartbroken and thwarted, plotting his next move. The stage was set for a confrontation, not a battle of gods, but a contest between a master spy and a perfect warden. The chronicles of Hera's wrath are filled with tales of tormented lovers and persecuted offspring. These were attacks on the periphery, strikes against the symptoms of her husband's chaotic nature, but they were, in the end, indirect. You can only treat the symptoms for so long before you decide to go after the disease itself. There was one legendary occasion when Hera, pushed past the breaking point by Zeus's endless arrogance and tyranny, decided to stop punishing his lovers and start punishing him. This was not just another domestic dispute. This was a political coup, an attempt to fundamentally change the power structure of the heavens. A great rebellion aimed at the throne of the cosmos itself. The final straw is not recorded, but it's easy to imagine. Perhaps it was one affair too many, or a decree made without her consultation that undermined her own authority. Whatever it was, Hera decided that Zeus's rule had become an intolerable dictatorship. She knew she could not act alone, so she began to move through the golden halls of Olympus, like a master strategist, gathering allies. Her recruitment pitch was simple. Zeus had become too proud, too dismissive of the other gods, and it was time to remind him that he was a king, not a tyrant. Her first and most powerful recruit was her own brother, Poseidon, Lord of the Sea. Poseidon had always harbored a deep-seated resentment, feeling that the division of the cosmos had left him with a lesser domain than his younger brother. He was proud, moody, and powerful, and he chafed under Zeus's authority. He eagerly joined the conspiracy. The second, and most surprising conspirator, was Athena. She was Zeus's favorite daughter, the goddess of wisdom herself. Her involvement was a testament to how far Zeus must have overstepped his bounds. For the goddess of strategy to join a rebellion against her own father meant that she, with her cold logic, had calculated that his removal was a necessary, logical step. With the Lord of the Sea and the goddess of wisdom at her side, Hera had both the muscle and the brains it needed to succeed. They waited for the perfect moment of divine vulnerability. After a grand feast, when Zeus was drowsy with nectar and ambrosia, fast asleep on his golden throne, moving with a silence that defied their immense power, the three conspirators crept into the throne room. They carried with them throngs of tough rawhide, enchanted to be unbreakable. While the king of the universe snored, they bound him to his throne, wrapping the straps around his wrists, his torso, his ankles, and securing them with 100 intricate, magical knots that no one but they could untie. For good measure, they took his thunderbolt, the symbol and source of his power, and hid it away. The coup was a stunning success. The omnipotent king was a helpless prisoner, but overthrowing a tyrant is one thing. Deciding what comes next is another. The moment their rebellion succeeded, the alliance began to fracture. They immediately started arguing over who should take his place, whose vision for the cosmos should now be law. The power vacuum they had created was already turning them against one another. While they squabbled, one lesser deity, the sea nymph Thetis, watched in horror. She saw that their coup would not lead to a new era of justice, but to a celestial civil war that could tear the universe apart. She had to act, and here we find a fascinating, quirky detail of the myth. Thetis didn't appeal to another Olympian. She knew this was a problem the current administration could not solve. She dove deep into the sea and traveled to the very foundations of the earth to call upon an older, more terrifying power. She summoned Briareus, one of the Hecatonkaias, the 100. These were the elder brothers of the Titans, primordial beings of immense power who had been freed by Zeus to help him win the Titanomachy. Briareus was a living mountain of muscle, with 50 heads and 100 powerful arms. He rose from the depths and lumbered into the throne room of Olympus. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The sight of this primordial giant, a being of raw, chaotic power that predated them all, was enough to strike terror into the hearts of the rebels. Briareus simply sat down beside the bound Zeus, flexing his 100 arms. The message was clear. This throne was protected by forces they could not possibly comprehend or fight. The conspiracy dissolved in an instant of pure fear. Without another word, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena untied Zeus and retreated. Zeus was free, and he was incandescently furious. He seized Poseidon and Athena, but his primary rage was reserved for the ringleader, his own wife. He subjected her to a terrible and humiliating punishment. He hung her from the highest point of the heavens by a golden chain tied around her wrists, and to her feet he attached 2 heavy anvils to ensure she could not escape. There she dangled, the Queen of Heaven, shamed before all of creation. The other gods wept at the sight, but were too terrified of Zeus's wrath to intervene. Classicists still argue about the meaning of this powerful myth. Is it a reflection of Greek political life, mirroring the unstable alliances and factionalism of their city-states? Or is it a stark piece of monarchist propaganda, a cautionary tale that shows that even a flawed, tyrannical king is preferable to the chaos of rebellion, thereby cementing the idea that Zeus's authority must be absolute to maintain order? Whatever its meaning, for Hera, the lesson was brutal and final. She had tried to change the system through direct revolution and had failed utterly. Zeus's power, backed by the ancient and terrible forces of the cosmos, was unassailable. Her rebellion was crushed, her dignity stripped. Having learned she could never win a direct war with her husband, her immense frustration and rage would now be channeled into a new kind of war, a long, bitter, and relentless campaign of persecution against the living symbol of his infidelity. Her greatest project of revenge was about to begin, and its target was Zeus's most famous illegitimate son, the hero, Heracles. After the humiliation of the Great Rebellion, of being dangled from the heavens by her own husband, Hera's rage cooled into something far more dangerous, a long-term, strategic hatred. She had learned she could not unseat the king, so she would dedicate herself to destroying his legacy, and the perfect target for this new, focused vendetta was about to be born. This child would be the living symbol of Zeus's most arrogant affair, and Hera would ensure his life was not a hero's journey, but a crucible of unending suffering forged by her own hand. The child's name would eventually be Heracles, and his story begins with one of Zeus's most elaborate and cynical deceptions. The object of Zeus's desire was Alcmene, the famously virtuous and faithful wife of Amphitryon, a great general of Thebes. While Amphitryon was away at war, Zeus descended. He didn't come as a swan or a bull this time. He came disguised as Alcmene's own husband, supposedly returning victorious from battle. To complete the ruse and prolong his enjoyment, he performed a bit of cosmic manipulation. He made the sun stand still for 2 days, creating a single night that lasted for the length of 3. For Alcmene, it was a night of long-awaited reunion with her beloved husband. For Zeus, it was a triumphant deception. For Hera, it was an unforgivable insult, an act of such audacious sacrilege that the resulting child could not be allowed to prosper. Zeus, puffed up with pride over the demigod he had just sired, returned to Olympus and made a fatal error. He boasted in front of the entire divine assembly. He declared that on this very day, a child of his own blood, a descendant of the great hero Perseus, would be born. And this child was destined to be the king of the gold-rich city of Mycenae. It was a grand proclamation, a sacred oath, and Hera, listening quietly, saw not a prophecy to be feared, but a contract with a loophole to be exploited. She would not prevent the birth of this hero. She would subvert it. She would use Zeus's own words to enslave his favorite son. Countermove was a masterclass in mythological legalism. First, she swooped down from Olympus to the palace in Thebes, where Alcmene was now in the throes of labor. There, she called upon her daughter Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, the same tool she had withheld from Leto. Hera commanded Eileithyia to sit at the threshold of Alcmene's chamber and to hold her own knees, ankles, and fingers tightly crossed. This act of sympathetic magic physically sealed Alcmene's womb. For 7 days and nights, Alcmene suffered in agonizing, fruitless labor, unable to give birth, while Zeus's chosen hero was magically imprisoned in the womb. Hera flew to the palace of Sthenelus, the king of Mycenae. Sthenelus was also a descendant of Perseus, and his wife was 7 months pregnant. Hera used her divine power to induce a premature labor. A sickly, weak infant named Eurystheus was born. With Eurystheus now born, Hera returned to Olympus, her face a mask of innocence. She calmly approached her husband and pointed out the facts. A child of his bloodline, a descendant of Perseus, had indeed been born on this day, as he had prophesied. His name was according to Zeus's own unbreakable oath. This weakling, not the heroic son still trapped in the womb, was now the rightful king of Mycenae. Zeus was caught. He looked down and saw the trick, saw his own boast twisted into a leash that would be held by a lesser man. He was enraged, but he was bound by his word. His son, the boy destined for greatness, was now fated to be the subject and servant of his cowardly cousin. Only after her victory was complete did Hera relent. The spell on Alcmene was broken when one of her clever servants, a woman named Gala, tricked Eileithyia. She ran out of the room shouting with false joy that the baby had been born. Startled, the goddess of childbirth leaped to her feet, uncrossing her legs and breaking the magical seal. Finally, Alcmene gave birth to twins, Iphicles, the mortal son of Amphitryon, who had returned home later on that same long night, and Alcides, the mighty son of Zeus. The boy was named Alcides at birth. It was only later that he would be given the name we all know him by, Heracles, and in one of history's greatest ironies, that name means the glory of Hera. It was perhaps given as a desperate attempt to appease the furious goddess, but it would become a label that dripped with bitter irony, as his entire life would be defined by her persecution. Was this incredible figure a pure invention of myth, or, as classicists still argue, could he have been a real, historical figure? Perhaps a local strongman from the Argive plain, a human hero whose feats were so legendary that they could only be explained over generations of storytelling, by making him the son of a god and giving his struggles a divine antagonist. The line between a historical hero and a mythological demigod is often blurry, and Heracles walks that line perhaps more than any other figure. But for now, he was just a baby, resting in his cradle. Yet his fate was already sealed. Thanks to his father's arrogance and his archenemy's cunning, he was born not as a king, but as a servant. Hera had already won the first, and arguably the most decisive, battle in their long war. She had set the board, and now all the pieces were in place for the suffering she intended to inflict. Her first direct attempt on his life was coming, and it would come before he could even walk. Hera had won the legal battle. Through clever manipulation of her husband's own boastful prophecy, she had ensured his favorite son would be born a servant, not a king. For a goddess of order and status, this was a masterful victory. But it wasn't enough. Legal victories are satisfying to the mind, but they do little to soothe a heart consumed by a burning, personal hatred. Her rage demanded more than mere subjugation. It demanded annihilation. While the infant son of Zeus slept soundly in his cradle, completely unaware of the cosmic destiny that had just been stolen from him, Hera planned his murder. His life had barely begun, and she was already preparing its end. That very night, the palace of Amphitryon in Thebes fell into a deep and peaceful quiet. Alcmene, exhausted from her supernaturally long labor, had bathed her twin sons, Alcides and his fully mortal brother Iphicles. She placed them together in their cradle, which, in some tellings, was their father's own mighty bronze shield, a fitting first bed for a future warrior. The household slept, but on Olympus, the queen was wide awake. Under the cover of a moonless night, she unleashed her assassins. These were not mortal men who could be fought off by palace guards. They were two monstrous serpents, enormous creatures with scales that shimmered like malevolent jewels and eyes that glowed with a cold fire. They moved not with a natural slither, but with a sinister, silent purpose. Divine agents of the queen's will. By Hera's magic, the doors to the nursery swung open without a sound. The two great snakes flowed across the stone floor, their forked tongues tasting the air, homing in on the scent of the infants. They coiled up the side of the great shield cradle and reared up over the two sleeping babies, their formidable heads casting long, dancing shadows in the faint torchlight. Their fangs, dripping with a venom that could kill 100 men, were poised to strike. It was the mortal twin, Iphicles, who woke first. He saw the two terrifying, scaly heads looming over him, and he did what any mortal infant would do. He let out a piercing shriek of pure terror, kicking his legs and trying to wriggle away in a panic. His screams were the alarm that would soon bring his parents running. But his twin brother, Alcides, the future Heracles, had a very different reaction. Awakened by the commotion, he opened his eyes and saw the two giant serpents, and he did not cry. Some poets say he laughed, his baby gurgles expressing not fear, but delight. To his infant eyes, these were not assassins. They were the most fascinating new playthings he had ever seen. That as the snakes lunged, the 10-month-old demigod sat up. His chubby, infant hands shot out with a speed and precision that was utterly unnatural. He seized both serpents, one in each fist, grabbing them firmly by their thick necks. The monstrous creatures were shocked. They began to thrash and writhe, their powerful bodies coiling round his arms and torso, trying to constrict the breath from him. They hissed and snapped, but the baby's grip was like iron. It was the grip of a god. With a look of happy concentration on his face, Alcides simply squeezed. The hissing turned to choked gurgles as he relentlessly tightened his fists, cutting off their air, crushing their spines. Just then, Alcmene and Amphitryon, roused by the terrified screams of Iphicles, burst into the room brandishing swords, followed by servants with torches. They froze in the doorway, confronted with a scene of impossible strangeness. There was Iphicles, red-faced and screaming, his lungs out, and beside him sat Alcides, perfectly calm, happily babbling to himself, and dangling from each of his tiny, triumphant fists with a limp, dead bodies of two gigantic snakes. As the poet Pindar tells it, Amphitryon was struck by a complex storm of emotions, sheer terror at what had almost happened, but also a deep, soul-shaking wave of awe and a strange, fearsome joy. In that instant, every doubt, every suspicion about his wife and the true parentage of this child vanished. This was no son of his. This was the son of a god. It was the moment of confirmation, a terrifying honor that revealed both his wife's divine affair and his stepson's magnificent, perilous destiny. This story, as vivid as it is part of a grand tradition. Classicists still argue whether the snakes in the cradle motif is a unique invention for Heracles, or if it's a classic, the example of a widespread mythological trope known as the infant hero's first trial. You can find similar stories in cultures across the world, from heroes in ancient India to epic figures in Persia. It's a powerful and efficient piece of narrative shorthand, a way for a story to announce from the very beginning, pay attention, this child is not like other children. This one is chosen, marked by fate, and possessed of divine power. Hera's first murder attempt had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. Not only had she failed to kill the baby, but her attack had served as the catalyst for his true nature to be revealed. The secret was out. Amphitryon, now certain of the boy's lineage, summoned the blind prophet Tiresias, who confirmed it all. He foretold the boy's epic struggles, his famous 12 labors, his battles with monsters, and his ultimate, fiery end that would lead to him becoming a god himself. Hera's plan had backfired completely. She had tried to secretly execute a baby and ended up orchestrating the announcement of a living demigod. Her failure only stoked the fires of her hatred, and she began to plot for the long war ahead, a war of attrition that would last his entire life. Hera's attempt to murder the infant Heracles in his cradle was a catastrophic failure, but a deeply informative one. It taught her that her husband's son was protected by a strength that was more than mortal. A direct physical attack was likely to fail. So, the Queen of Strategy fell back to her long game. She had already twisted his destiny, ensuring he would be born a servant instead of a king. Now, she would simply wait and watch, nurturing the seeds of his own destruction that lay within him. His immense, uncontrollable strength, and the fiery temper he inherited from his father. Heracles' childhood was not easy. He was a demigod, trying to live in a mortal world that was simply too fragile for him. His tutors were driven to despair. In wrestling, he would accidentally break his training partner's bones. Simple games would end with shattered equipment. He was a boy with the power of a tectonic plate and the emotional control of a thunderclap. The first true tragedy of his youth, the incident that set him on his path, involved his music teacher, a man named Linus, said to be the brother of the master musician Orpheus himself. During a lesson, Linus corrected Heracles, perhaps a bit too sharply, for a clumsy note played on the lyre. Heracles, in a flash of adolescent frustration, and not realizing the catastrophic force of his own limbs, reacted. He picked up the instrument and struck his teacher with it, crushing the man's skull in an instant. It was a horrifying accident, but it was also a revelation. His stepfather, Amphitryon, realized with a heavy heart that Heracles was simply too powerful and too volatile to be raised in the city, for the safety of everyone, himself included. He exiled the boy to the countryside, to live as a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron. This was meant to be a punishment, a way to keep him out of trouble, but it became his training ground. Alone in the wilderness, he wrestled wolves and hunted lions, honing his raw power into a set of formidable skills. He grew from a clumsy, dangerous boy into a peerless warrior. he returned to Thebes a young man in full command of his physical self, and became a great war hero, single-handedly winning a conflict for the city. The grateful king gave Heracles his own daughter, the Princess Megara, as a wife. For a brief, shining period, Heracles was happy. He was a celebrated hero, a loving husband, and soon, a proud father to several children. He had found peace, and for Hera, watching from on high, the sight of his happiness was an intolerable insult. This was the moment she had been waiting for. It was time to spring the trap she had so patiently set decades before, on the day of his birth. The full, terrible story of what she did to his family we will cover next. But for now, know that she inflicted upon him a temporary madness so profound that it led to an unforgivable tragedy. When the madness cleared, Heracles was a broken man, crushed by a grief and guilt so immense that he exiled himself. Seeking purification for his actions, he traveled to the most sacred place in the ancient world, the Oracle of Delphi, the mouthpiece of the god Apollo. And it was here that Hera's grand, overarching plan finally came to fruition. The Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, listened to his plea and delivered her god's decree. To atone for his sins, he must travel to Mycenae and serve his cousin, King Eurystheus, the very same sickly, premature cousin Hera had schemed onto the throne. He was to perform any 10 tasks Eurystheus commanded. It was also at this moment that the oracle stripped him of his birth name, Alcides, and officially named him Heracles, the glory of Hera. It was a name that would forever brand him as the property of his greatest enemy, a constant, humiliating reminder that his life's great trials, his atonement, was all part of her design. These famous labors were not random acts of pest control. Eurystheus himself was a weak, cowardly man, utterly terrified of his godlike cousin. A quirky but famous detail is that Eurystheus was so frightened he had a giant bronze storage jar, a pithos, buried near his throne so he could dive into it and hide whenever Heracles returned with some terrifying monster. Eurystheus was not the author of these tasks. He was merely the mouthpiece. The labors were conceived in the cold, hateful mind of Hera herself and whispered into the terrified king's ear. Each of the 12 labors became 12 after Eurystheus refused to count 2 of them on technicalities, was chosen with a single goal in mind, to kill Heracles in a way that looked like a noble, heroic death. They were, in essence, a series of state-sponsored suicide missions. This cycle of 12 great trials has led many to wonder about its deeper meaning. Classicists and mythographers still argue whether the story of the 12 labors might be a grand astronomical allegory. In this theory, Heracles is a solar hero, a personification of the sun. His journey through 12 labors is a mythological retelling of the sun's annual journey through the 12 houses of the zodiac. Each labor, from the Nemean lion of Leo to the golden apples of the Hesperides, corresponds to a challenge represented by a constellation. It's a theory that transforms his adventures from a simple hero's quest into a cosmic drama played out in the heavens. The stage was now set. The cowardly king, the vengeful queen pulling the strings from behind the curtain, and the guilt-ridden hero bound by divine law to obey. The entire structure of the 12 labors was Hera's masterpiece of revenge. But before the first of those labors could begin, we must turn to the darkness that came before the dawn, the terrible, central crime that forced our hero to accept his sentence, and the single most cruel act Hera ever perpetrated against him. For a short, blissful time, the hero Heracles knew peace. He was married to the Princess Megara, and their home was filled with the sounds of their growing children. He was celebrated by the people of Thebes, loved by his wife, and adored by his sons. He was everything a hero was supposed to be, strong, accomplished, and at the head of a happy, thriving family. And it was this very image of domestic bliss, the one thing she herself had never truly known, that Hera could not, under any circumstances, tolerate. His happiness was a personal affront to her own miserable marriage. Snakes had failed. Legal maneuvering, while satisfying, was too slow. The queen decided it was time to deploy a weapon against which Heracles had no defense. She would not attack his body. She would obliterate his mind. In one of the most chilling passages from ancient Greek tragedy, the playwright Euripides gives us a glimpse into the mechanics of this cruelty. Hera did not simply cast a spell from on high. She dispatched her messenger, the rainbow goddess Iris, with a terrible order. Iris flew down to the shadowy depths of the underworld to summon Lyssa, the primordial and terrifying goddess of madness, rage, and frenzy. Lyssa was a being of pure, rabid chaos, but even she was horrified by Hera's command. In the play, Lyssa protests. She argues that Heracles is a great benefactor of humanity, a cleanser of the world who has slain monsters and made the road safe. She does not wish to harm him. But Iris is unmoved, her voice as cold as the void. It is the will of Hera, she states, and not even the goddess of madness can defy the queen. Reluctantly, tragically, Lyssa agrees to do her bidding. She rises from the darkness to infect the hero's mind. The madness descended upon Heracles without warning. He was in his home, perhaps in the middle of a meal, or playing with his children on the floor. Suddenly, his vision began to swim. The world twisted around him. A grotesque, inhuman grin spread across his face as foam flecked his lips. In his mind, a terrifying delusion took hold, whispered into his ear by Lyssa. His peaceful home was no longer his own. It was the fortress of his enemy. The cowardly king Eurystheus and his family, his beloved wife and children, were no longer his own. In his maddened eyes, they transformed into the monstrous agents of the king, sent there to ambush and kill him. He seized his massive club and his unstrung bow. His own home became his hunting ground. Every loving face became a mask. Every childish laugh became a demonic threat. He saw not his sons running towards him for a hug, but slavering beasts launching an attack. He saw not his wife Megara pleading with him to recognize her, but the treacherous leader of the enemy forces. He became a force of pure destruction. His divine strength, once used to protect the innocent, now turned upon the very people who were the center of his world. The happy home filled with sounds of breaking wood, the splintering of his own weapons against the walls, and then a terrible, profound silence. The goddess Athena, taking some small pity on him, finally intervened. She hurled a massive stone at his chest, knocking him unconscious and bringing the rampage to an end. He lay in a stupor for a time, while his servants, weeping, tied him to a broken pillar to prevent him from doing any more harm. He awoke slowly, his head thick and his body aching. The madness was gone. The world snapped back into its proper shape. He saw his home in ruins, his weapons shattered. And then he saw them. Lying amongst the debris were the bodies of his wife and his children, all slain by his own hand. The horror that washed over him was an ocean of grief, so vast it could drown a god. The strongest man in the world was rendered completely helpless, shattered by a realization so monstrous it was almost impossible to bear. He didn't just weep. He let out a roar of pure, animalistic agony. He, the great protector, had become the great destroyer. His hands, which had strangled serpents and slain monsters, were covered in the blood of his own family. He craved only his own death, a final escape from the crime he could never undo. It was his friend and cousin, the hero Theseus, who found him in this state and convinced him that suicide was a coward's path. The true test of a hero, he argued, was not in his strength, but in his ability to endure the unendurable. Was this horrifying act always the reason for his famous labors? Classicists still argue that in the oldest layers of the Heracles myth, the story of him murdering his family doesn't exist. In those versions, the labors were simply tasks he performed. Many believe this deeply psychological and tragic motivation was a later invention, added by the great Athenian playwrights to transform a simple strongman into a complex, tragic figure, a hero haunted by his own actions. Regardless of when it entered his story, it is now the linchpin of his entire legend. This is the crime that drives him from his home. This is the stain on his soul that sends him on a desperate pilgrimage to the oracle at Delphi. And this is the guilt that makes him accept the oracle's sentence to become a slave to his lesser cousin and perform a series of impossible tasks. Hera had, at last, found the perfect revenge. She couldn't break his body, so she used his own power to break his spirit and poison his legacy forever. His quest for atonement was about to begin. For 12 straight sections, we have painted a portrait of a queen defined by her rage. We have chronicled her vengeance against lovers, accomplices, and most of all, against Heracles, the son of her husband's most hated affair. She has been the architect of madness, the orchestrator of impossible trials, the very embodiment of divine persecution. But what if I told you that at the exact same time she was meticulously engineering the suffering of Greece's greatest hero, she was also acting as the devoted, powerful, and indispensable patron of another? This is the great paradox of Hera. She was not a universal force of destruction. She was a goddess of powerful, specific loyalties. And while she was the villain of Heracles' story, she was the undisputed godmother of Jason and his Argonauts. To understand this startling alliance, we must travel north to the kingdom of Io. Here, the rightful heir to the throne, a young man named Jason, had been usurped by his power-hungry uncle, Peleus. Now, kings usurping thrones was not uncommon, but Peleus had made two fatal mistakes. First, he was an impious man who, in his regular sacrifices to the gods, pointedly neglected to honor Hera. This was a foolish, but perhaps survivable, slight. His second crime, however, was unforgivable. He murdered his own stepmother Sidero to secure his power. And he didn't just murder her, he killed her while she was clinging desperately to the altar in Hera's own temple, seeking sanctuary. This was an act of supreme sacrilege, a defilement of Hera's sacred space that stained her honor directly. Peleus had made an enemy of the most powerful and patient queen in the cosmos, and Hera decided that Jason would be the instrument of her revenge. She did not reveal herself to him at first. She tested him. As Jason journeyed to Iolcus to reclaim his birthright, he came to the banks of the river Anaros, which was raging and swollen from recent rains, and there on the bank was a frail, helpless old woman, begging to be carried across. This, of course, was Hera in disguise. Other, prouder men might have ignored her, but Jason, in a simple act of compassion, hoisted the old woman onto his broad shoulders and waded into the treacherous current. The water was strong and the mud was thick, and in the struggle, he lost one of his sandals, which was sucked away by the river. He delivered the old woman safely to the other side, never knowing he had just passed the most important test of his life. He had shown piety and respect for the helpless, two virtues Hera valued immensely. He had also, by losing his sandal, fulfilled a prophecy that warned Peleus to beware a man wearing only one shoe. From that moment on, Hera was Jason's secret weapon. When Peleus, unnerved by the arrival of the one-sandaled man, tried to get rid of Jason by sending him on an impossible quest for the Golden Fleece, it was Hera who had planted the idea in his mind. She knew the quest would not kill Jason. It would forge him into a legend and ultimately lead to Peleus' own downfall. She helped inspire the shipwright Argus to construct his magnificent ship, the Argo. It was her divine influence that helped gather the most impressive crew of heroes ever assembled, the Argonauts, which even included her nemesis, Heracles, for a portion of the journey. Throughout their voyage, she was the unseen hand guiding them. When they were threatened by the clashing rocks, the Symplegades that smashed any ship passing between them, it was Hera who gave them the divine assistance needed to get through. Think of the contrast. For Heracles, every labor was a death trap, designed by Hera. For Jason, every challenge was a growth opportunity, supervised by Hera to ensure his success. She was simultaneously running two rival hero programs, one designed for failure, the other engineered for victory. This leads to a fascinating scholarly debate. Classicists still argue about her true motives. Was her patronage of Jason really just about a personal grudge against Peleus, or was it a far grander strategic move in her eternal chess match against Zeus? By creating and sponsoring a hero who was entirely her own, was she attempting to build a power base to rival the fame and influence of Zeus's favorite son, Heracles? Jason's success would be her success, proving she could manufacture a hero every bit as great as the ones her husband could sire. Her methods were as cunning as they were powerful. When the Argonauts finally reached Colchis, home of the Golden Fleece, Jason found himself stonewalled by its king. Physical strength wasn't enough. He needed an edge. Hera knew this. In a brilliant move, she went to the goddess of love, Aphrodite. She begged, flattered, and perhaps even bribed Aphrodite to intervene. She asked her to send her son Eros to strike the heart of the king's daughter, the powerful and dangerous sorceress Medea, so that she would fall madly and uncontrollably in love with Jason. Hera weaponized love itself. It was Medea's magic, fueled by a love manufactured by the gods, that allowed Jason to overcome the fire-breathing bulls and the dragon-toothed warriors and finally seize the fleece. This entire saga reveals a side of Hera we rarely see. She is not a simple caricature of jealousy. She is a goddess of principles, admittedly, her own fiercely held principles. She demands piety. She demands respect for the sanctity of marriage, family, and most of all, her own altars. If you honor these things, as Jason did, she will move heaven and earth to ensure your success. If you defile them, as Peleus and, in his own way, Zeus did, she will dedicate her immortal existence to your ruin. She was never just a villain. She was a queen, with a strict, and often brutal, code of honor. Hera's motivations, as we've seen, were often rooted in a strict, if self-serving, code of honor and piety. She was a goddess of principles, but she was still a Greek god, and that meant she was susceptible to one of the most powerful and dangerous divine flaws of all, vanity. Her status as Queen of the Heavens was not, in her mind, merely a title. It was a reflection of a fundamental truth about her own supreme worthiness and beauty, and any challenge to that personal pride, however small, could provoke a reaction just as devastating as a defiled altar. This brings us to a wedding, an apple, and the calamitous beauty contest that plunged the mortal world into its most famous war. The stage for this drama was the wedding of the century, the union of the sea-nymph, Thetis, and the mortal king, Peleus. You might remember Thetis was the one who bravely summoned the hundred-handed giant to save Zeus from Hera's own rebellion. Now, it was her day to be celebrated. All the gods and goddesses were invited to the grand feast on Mount Pelion. Well, almost all of them. The wedding planners made one critical omission from the guest list: Eris, the goddess of discord. Understandable, perhaps who wants discord at a wedding? But a foolish oversight nonetheless. Eris, naturally offended by the snub, decided to give the happy couple a wedding gift that would keep on giving. She materialized at the edge of the celebration just long enough to toss a solid gold apple into the midst of the goddesses, and on its gleaming skin were carved 3 simple words: Callistae, for the fairest. It was a spark thrown into a powder keg. 3 goddesses immediately lunged for it, each believing the apple was rightfully hers. First was Athena, the brilliant warrior goddess, embodiment of wisdom and divine strategy. Second was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, for whom physical charm was her entire domain. And third, of course, was Hera, the Queen of Heaven, who believed her regal majesty and supreme status made her, by default, the fairest of them. All the party came to a halt as the 3 most powerful goddesses on Olympus glared at one another. The golden apple having become a symbol of a suddenly very serious dispute, they turned to Zeus to be the judge. But Zeus, for all his flaws, was no fool. He instantly recognized this for what it was, a no-win situation. To choose one would be to earn the eternal resentment of the other 2, and one of them was his famously vengeful wife. He wisely recused himself. Instead, he outsourced the problem. He declared that the only fair judge would be a mortal, someone with no divine alliances who could render an impartial verdict. He chose a young man living as a shepherd on remote Mount Ida, a man named Paris. What Zeus perhaps conveniently failed to mention was that this shepherd was secretly a prince of Troy, hidden away at birth because of a prophecy that he would be the city's ruin. The 3 goddesses descended to find the handsome young prince. Each, in turn, attempted to bribe him, and their offers are a perfect reflection of their own characters. Hera came first, in all her regal glory. She did not offer trinkets or trifles. She offered what she herself embodied: power. She promised to make Paris the king of all of Europe and Asia, a supreme emperor with dominion over all mortals. It was a bribe of legitimate, structured authority. Next came Athena, clad in her gleaming armor. She offered excellence in the realms she governed, wisdom and war. She promised to make Paris the wisest of all men, and to ensure he was victorious in every battle he ever fought. Finally, it was Aphrodite's turn. She approached him not with promises of power or glory, but with a whisper of pure temptation. She promised him the love and hand of the most beautiful mortal woman in the existence, Helen of Sparta. Paris, a young man ruled by passion rather than by ambition or intellect, made his choice. He handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. In that moment, he sealed his own fate, and the fate of his city. He had won the love of Helen, but he had made a permanent and unforgiving enemy of both the goddess of wisdom and, more terrifyingly, the Queen of Heaven. Was this petty squabble always the official cause of the Trojan War? Classicists still argue about it. The story of the judgment of Paris doesn't appear in the Iliad itself, which starts in the final year of the war. Many think it was a later addition to the mythology, perhaps from a lost epic called the Priya, created to give the decade-long conflict a more dramatic, romantic, and divinely ordained origin story than a simple squabble over trade routes. Whatever its origins, it became the accepted truth. Hera's reaction to the slight was not one of hot, impulsive anger, but of a cold, enduring, strategic hatred. Her pride had been wounded. A mortal had dared to declare another more beautiful. Her outrage was no longer just aimed at Paris. It was aimed at his entire people. For the next 10 years, during the brutal Trojan War, Hera was the most ferocious and most cunning ally of the Achaean or Greek forces. She would deceive Zeus, manipulate battles, and pour all of her immense power into the singular goal of ensuring Troy was not just defeated, but utterly erased from the earth. The personal insult on Mount Ida had become a geopolitical catastrophe. For Hera, a blow to her vanity was a blow against the natural order of things, and the price for that would be paid in blood and fire. The Trojan War became the final great theater for Hera's complex character. For 10 brutal years, every facet of her being, her strategic mind, her capacity for grudges, her vanity, and her willingness to defy her own husband, was on full display. Her hatred for Paris and the Trojans was the fuel that powered the Greek war machine, and in one of the most famous episodes in the Iliad, she demonstrated that she had long since graduated from being the victim of her husband's deceptions to being a master of them herself. Seeing the battle turning against her favored Achaeans, she devised a plan to neutralize the one god powerful enough to stop her, Zeus. She began by making herself beautiful. She bathed in ambrosia, anointed herself with sacred oils, and dressed in her most magnificent robes. Then, in a move of pure cunning, she went to her rival, Aphrodite, and asked to borrow her enchanted girdle, a magical item that made its wearer irresistibly desirable. Aphrodite, flattered, agreed. Armed with this borrowed power of allure, Hera went to Zeus on Mount Ida. As he watched the battle below, he was instantly overcome with a passion that, as he himself declared, was more powerful than any he had ever felt before. He embraced her, and as he lay sleeping in her arms afterward, Hera gave the signal. Her brother Poseidon rallied the Greek troops, and the tide of the war turned, all because Hera had used her husband's greatest weakness against him. It was the cuckoo story in reverse, with her now the clever predator, and he the witless prey. So we come to the end of our journey. Having navigated the turbulent currents of Hera's story, we have seen the vengeful queen who persecuted Leto across the globe and turned Io into a wandering cow. We have seen the cunning strategist who laid perfect, inescapable traps for Semele and Echo. We have witnessed the bitter rival who engineered the entire miserable life of Heracles, from the subversion of his royal destiny to the madness that destroyed his family. But we have also seen the devoted patron who guided Jason and the Argonauts to glory, the fierce ally who fought for the Greeks at Troy, and the political rebel who dared to chain the king of the gods to his own throne. All of these contradictory roles, all these acts of cruelty and of loyalty, spring from a single, consistent source, her divine portfolio. Hera was the goddess of order, of legitimacy, of the sacred and unbreakable vow of marriage. Her entire immortal existence was a testament to these principles. Her tragedy is that she was married to the one being in the universe most dedicated to shattering them. Every affair Zeus conducted was not just an act of infidelity. It was a direct assault on the foundations of Hera's power and her very reason for being. Her rage, in this light, begins to look less like simple jealousy and more like the desperate, unending struggle of a queen to protect her domain against the chaos introduced by her own king. This is perhaps why, despite the oft stories, the mortals of ancient Greece held her in such high esteem. A quirky but revealing fact lies in stone and dirt: the ruins of her temples. The Heraians, at places like Samos and Argos, are among the very first and very largest monumental temples ever built in Greece. Her cult was ancient, powerful, and deeply respected, in some places predating the worship of Zeus himself. To the people who brought her offerings, she was not just a cosmic nag. She was the august protector of their cities, their families, and the legitimacy of their rulers. She was the matriarch. And so, we are left with the final question, the one that classicists still argue today: is Hera a villain, or is she a tragic queen? Is she defined by the stunning cruelty of her actions, a monster of jealousy who tormented anyone who crossed her path? Or is she, perhaps, one of the most tragic figures on Olympus? A goddess whose own sacred domain was perpetually and publicly undermined by the one person who swore to be her partner. Her story does not offer an easy answer. She remains, forever, a complex tapestry of fierce protection and brutal vengeance. A queen who fought to uphold order with every tool at her disposal, even if that meant unleashing a little chaos of her own. Now, let the outside world and all its complexities fade away. The story of the Queen of Heaven is told, her long and turbulent reign now just a whisper in the quiet of the room. The conflicts that shook Olympus, the passions and the rages of the gods, can recede into the gentle darkness. Their struggles are not yours. Their cosmic dramas have no claim on your peace. Your only task now, as you lie here, safe and comfortable, is to let go. Feel the weight of the day gently lifting from your shoulders, drifting away like a cloud. From the peak of a silent mountain, there are no more stories to follow, no more destinies to untangle. There is only the soft and steady rhythm of your own breathing, a quiet, reassuring beat in the stillness. Let that rhythm be your guide, leading you down into a place of deep, untroubled rest. The great throne of Olympus is empty for the night, its queen at peace at last. And so too can you be. Just allow your mind to grow quiet, to grow still, and to drift into the soft, welcoming landscape of your dreams. Take one last, slow, deep breath, and sleep.